So first of all, let me say it's an honor to be here. I'm so grateful to have been invited to be part of this conversation tonight. I want to thank the Veritas Forum and Carmen House and Aaron for your kind invitation, from my esteemed colleagues who will be joining me and we'll be having conversation throughout this. And I also am just really grateful to be in a room with other human beings, because we know that if we're here to talk about this topic that we want to explore tonight, this notion of suffering and hope, we know that to be human is to suffer. Would you agree with me about that? Like, you don't have to, like most of us in this room, we don't have to really wonder about what is suffering? I don't really know what he's talking about. We know what it means. I mean, you've played Michigan. And I'm an Ohio State fan, so I can say this, right? So we know that there is some sense of suffering, but what does it mean for us to find hope in the middle of suffering? And what does it mean for me as a Jesus follower to talk about that and explore that? And one of the things I'm going to invite us to consider is that as a Jesus follower, in fact, hope is not something that we find, it is something we form. It is not an abstract thing that is out there that I hope lands in my lap. But it's something that I form, but never by myself. Even in the face of suffering, the hope that I form, which we'll talk about in just a little bit, the hope that I form is always going to be formed in the context of community. But first, a word about suffering. In clinical work in psychiatry, one of the ways that we talk about suffering, this is true in other literature, that when we talk about suffering, it is the experience that we as humans have of pain over time. It is our response to a noxious stimulus. And that pain can be experienced in any number of different ways. It can be experienced physically, mentally, relationally, psychologically, a range of different ways that we can talk about how we experience pain. Suffering is how we would describe my response to this noxious stimulus. How do I think about it? How do I emotionally respond to it? What do I do in response to it? That my suffering is my response to pain over time. And so we can see that suffering can come in lots of different packages. It can come quickly, last for a long time. It can come for a long period of time, but be very low grade. There are lots of different ways in which we suffer. And I would dare say that there are those in this room who are suffering right now in ways that not only are those who are in your life know about, but there are those of us who are in this room who are suffering in ways that nobody else knows about. And so when we talk about suffering, we would say that there are, at least from a clinical psychiatry standpoint, there are three primary categories whereby which suffering emerges. And the first is suffering happens because of things that happen to us. We can all name things that have happened to us that have created pain that has lasted. Some of us who are in this room have had medical conditions. Some of us in this room have had relational trauma of any number of different ways that sometimes is unspeakable to the degree that it's painful. We can have all kinds of things that happen to us. Now, interestingly, there is a second category of suffering that we experience, and oddly enough, this actually has to do with what we do to ourselves. And as it turns out, the most common way that we suffer is not just because of the thing that has happened to me, but because of the story that I tell, which we'll get to in just a moment about storytelling. What I do in response to what has happened to me often creates even more distress than the thing that happened to me in and of itself. So that's the first category, what's happened to me. The second category, what I do in response to it, what I do to myself. And then there's a third category in which we suffer because we are actually trying to live lives of greater wholeness. An easy example of this are those of you who are studying hard. Like, there's a certain degree of pain that goes into studying. If you're an athlete and you're going to have to be disciplined about certain things, there are going to be certain painful things. For people who are moving out of addiction, they have to move out of certain behaviors and into others, and in the course of doing so, there is a certain kind of suffering in which they are moving toward integration, toward wholeness, toward a life of flourishing, and the movement toward flourishing creates a certain pattern of, I have to get rid of things that I don't want to get rid of. Are you with me? Does that make sense? So this sense of what it means to suffer because I'm moving actually toward beauty and goodness is not something that we would typically consider, but it's a third category that's important for us to think about. Now, there's another important element about suffering that we can talk about, and it has to do with the mechanics of how the mind works. Because it's often helpful for us, we can talk about suffering in terms of my own kind of existential or subjective experience of my pain and what I'm doing in response to it over time. But what I really want to understand too are like, what are the mechanics of the mind? Because understanding how the mind works functionally is a helpful way for also for us to have a sense of what does suffering really mean, and how do we then construct hope in the middle of this? Because one of the things that we find about the mind is not just a thing that I think with, right? My mind is, as we like to say in our field, the mind is an emotional, relational, embodied process, right? It is an embodied and relational process. Your mind is not just the thing that you think with. It's not just limited to your brain. It's your entire body that is involved in your mind. But your body also has to have interactions with other people. It's relational, and it emerges over time. And its task is to regulate the flow of energy and information. I have particular neurobiochemical things that happen to me all day, every day. And every day I'm having to give meaning to these things. And my mind is a combination of all these things. And so I sense and I image and I feel and I think and I behave. Those 5 things that the mind does. And in order for the mind to flourish, the mind has to be integrated, not unlike an orchestra. Each section practicing really hard, but also paying attention to the other sections. Is what I'm sensing, paying attention to what I'm thinking. Is what I'm thinking, paying attention to what I'm perceiving, and so forth and so on. And one of the things that we describe and talk about suffering is what happens when those different functions are no longer integrated. And one of the most powerful ways that we come to integration in the mind, even as we talk about this, we're not even talking about faith yet. When we come to integration, when we come to wholeness, has to do with the way that we tell stories. One of the primary features about what it means to be human is that we tell stories like no other creature does. Everything about what we are doing day in and day out is our capacity to make sense of what we're sensing. We are continually telling stories from the time you were 2 years old and you found your first word, and then your second word, and your third word, and your first sentence. You then start to make sense of the story that you're living in. And everyone in this room right now is telling a story about yourself. You're telling a story about me. You're telling the story that you think I'm telling about you. We humans tell stories, and it is in the way that we tell stories that help us make sense of all of our things, including our suffering. And this is the last thing that's really crucial for us to consider when it comes to forming hope. Because one of the other things that's important to know about the mechanics of the mind is that it doesn't take much to think about this, that hope is not a thing then that only comes into play when we are in trouble. I hope I don't have cancer. I hope that we win the national championship. I hope all these things. Hope is actually a thing that you're putting into practice every day, all day. You don't know that you're doing this, but when you stand up and you walk out, you hope that the door's open. You're not thinking consciously of this, but you're doing it all the time. We are hopefully living all the time, all day, every day. And so hope is something that I'm actually creating. I'm forming it. And what suffering does is that it interrupts my capacity to form hope. And I'm only ever forming hope in the context, ultimately, of community and relationships with other people. And so one of the most important questions that we have when it comes to what we mean by suffering and what we do in response to it is this. In what story do you believe you're living? In what story do you believe you're living? Everyone in this room, myself included, we all believe that we are living in some story, whether we're paying attention to it or not. And that story that we believe that we're living in is shaping how we respond to suffering. And for those of us who are Jesus followers, we would say that this is where the biblical narrative is crucially important, because it is a story that speaks of a God who has made us because he loved us. He doesn't love us because he made us. He's made us because he first loved us. You got here and he said, like, oh my gosh, you're finally here. And that longing to love you and for you to feel that sense of being loved, no matter how deep your trauma or your suffering, that longing on God's part never changes. And so for us who are Jesus followers, we would say that my capacity to imagine a future in which my suffering is resolved only happens because in the present moment I have someone or people who are with me, who are enabling me to have the felt sense of being seen, soothed, safe, and secure right here and now, so that even in the middle of my pain is being shaped and formed in such a way that I can be hopeful because I'm not by myself with it. One of the most significant things that we would say about what humans experience as painful begins with anxiety, and anxiety is all about human beings at the very end of the day. Anxiety is all about human beings having the deep sense that I'm alone in the world and nobody is coming to find me. And the Christian story is all about a God who is coming to find us all day, every day. Here's a question for you. If I asked you, could you give me the names of 3 people who, if I were to ask them, they could tell me everything there is to know about you? Everything. They could tell me about your suffering. They could tell me your worst nightmares. They could tell me your deepest fears, your deepest longings. Are you so well known and so well loved that when the suffering comes, which is inevitable, when the suffering comes, you will know that you will not be alone with it? Our deepest pain and our deepest suffering is not just because of the pain that we experience, but because we are alone with it. And this is the story of the Christian scriptures. And this is why we who are Jesus followers would want to say that we form hope, we anticipate a future of goodness, because in the middle of things that are painful right here and now, I am with people who are loving me even in this space in which I can't change my circumstances. If I am given the opportunity to be seen, soothed, safe, and secure right here and now, that doesn't eliminate my pain, but it dramatically changes it, along with changing my brain in the process. And so in the course of our conversation tonight, how do we respond hopefully in the place of suffering? We want to ask the question, in what story do you believe that you're living? Because that story is going to dictate how you respond to your suffering. And the second question would be, by whom are you so deeply known and loved such that when your suffering comes, not if, but when your suffering comes, you will know that you can pay attention to being loved as much as you will pay attention to your pain, such that your suffering will not just be something that you have to endure, but it will be something that will be used to shape and change you and change those in your life around you, even if the suffering continues. Thank you again for your kind attention. I look forward to the comments from my colleague. Please join me up front.
I begin in the name of God, most gracious, most merciful. Thank you, Dr. Thompson. And I also would like to thank our hosts, Carmen House and Veritas Forum, for the opportunity to reflect deeply on this topic and for your thoughtful words and comments. As was mentioned, I work in the field of clinical ethics, and our team at OSU provides hospital consultations when people are struggling with ethical dilemmas or conflict or tension in deciding what might be the right thing to do for a patient. As you can imagine, a lot of our consult requests come from patients who are likely near the end of their life, and they're struggling with issues like, when do I take off the machines that might keep somebody's body going? We often work closely with palliative medicine physicians who are the specialists in managing care and symptoms for people who have diseases that they're not expected to recover from, like a cancer that may not have a cure. And we often hear people talking about how to manage pain and suffering. And so one of the things I wanted to begin with is this question of, are pain and suffering, do they always go together, or are they different concepts? There was an account that I found online, a blog, of a medical person, an occupational therapist, who was going through a very, very painful condition. And she was blogging her way through it. And I thought it would be instructive for us to reflect on this as we talk about the issues of pain and suffering. So I'm going to read some quotes from her blog and the experiences that she went through. It feels like a never-ending practice in pain tolerance. Unless you've given birth, there are few things that require so much pain for so much time. Rhythmic breathing helps me calm down. Distraction is the key to getting through. This last stage is going to take you into painful territory, very painful. My brain would either completely shut down or get very upset. What exactly is hurting so much? Everything. Your legs, your lower back, your arms, all ready to be done. The pain is like the worst type of ache imaginable. It's like your entire body is as sore as it has ever been in your entire life, but you still need to keep moving anyway. At times, all she could do is just repeat to herself, one foot in front of the other, one step at a time to try to get through. Is she suffering? What do you think? I'm seeing a lot of nodding. Okay, so I would have to ask her, how is she interpreting her pain? She has a picture of herself at the end of her blog, and so after going through all of this, I thought I would share the picture that she put up herself of her situation after all of this. There she is. Her blog is about what it feels like to run a marathon. She's a long-distance runner, and she has no other health problems. So her blog, betterthanalive.com, is about what it feels like to run a marathon. And here's what she says about it. She says, to say that the finish line of a race is a magical mix of emotions is an understatement. All at the same time, you're in more pain than you could ever imagine, more proud of yourself than you ever thought you could be, and extremely overwhelmed. So how does it feel like to run a marathon? It feels like the best and most rewarding type of pain out there, and that's why I keep coming back. So she was in pain. Now if you hear the rest of the story, does she seem like she was suffering? Okay, so when seeing people like say no. So I want to talk to you about a couple of just like definitions of these concepts, right? Pain is usually understood as an unpleasant physical sensation. It could be an unpleasant experience. It could be an unpleasant emotion. And it can be useful, right? Like if you have your hand on a hot stove and you feel pain and pull it back, I think we probably would be happy that we felt that pain, right? So that we could move our hand away. Otherwise, your hand could get totally burned and you would never even know. So it can be a protective factor. Suffering, however, and Dr. Thompson also talked about this, it involves an interpretation of the experience of pain, the tension that you create around the pain. So how we think about or interpret the pain can lead to or prevent the experience of suffering. Now, do you think we have agency over this, like how we interpret the pain or the tension that we create around the pain? Okay, if you're going to nod, you got to nod big because there's this big light in front of my eyes. So if you're not going to say anything, which is okay, then nod big. So can different people experience the same type of painful sensations but experience them differently with regards to whether or not they're suffering from them? Okay, good. Thank you for those big nods. I appreciate it. So many people would say we do have some type of agency over this. And I want to bring this question out. Like suppose, and I'll give you an example here. People may be experiencing the sensation of pain, but they may not be suffering due to it because of things that they're doing, like ways they're approaching it, right? And that could be things that you learn or things that are part of your personality, part of your faith tradition, right? So they could be accepting it, they could be practicing mindfulness, they could be reframing things, they could be cognitively reframing things. Religious beliefs or teachings can help people gain agency over their experience of pain and decrease the amount that they suffer because of it. Psychologists will have recommendations. But finding meaning in pain can reduce the suffering. And I'll tell you what I mean. So suppose somebody gets stabbed in the stomach in a dark alley, and they're in the hospital afterwards, and they're recovering, and they have to have surgery to kind of stitch themselves up. And every time they turn over, they feel this pain, and it makes them feel even worse. Like they remember what happened, they think the world is terrible, they feel really vulnerable, and they're like, this is horrible. So they're having pain and probably suffering as a result of it, right? Now, what about if that same person or a different person or whatever still had the experience of getting stabbed in the stomach, but it was actually a surgeon's scalpel that was cutting out a cancer that was going to kill them? So that person has the same experience of being stabbed in the stomach and their, stomach cut or abdomen cut open, a cancer removed, and then their recovery would still be after their abdomen was stitched up, right? But if they turned over, would they have a different experience maybe of how they interpret the pain? They might feel really grateful. Every time it reminds them, the pain of their experience, like that turning over, would remind them, oh my gosh, I could have died. That surgeon saved me. I'm so grateful. I'll get to see my grandkids. I get to see my family. That experience of the pain, the same pain, might bring them like a whole different experience, right? Like they could be grateful and it could be like a totally different experience. So that's what I'm talking about when we talk about decoupling pain from suffering. Finding meaning can separate that. So the meaning, i.e. the pain is due to the surgeon removing the cancer, helps them not have the same experience, or at least be able to cope with it much better. So, and we talked about this with both the marathon runner as well as the surgeon. If suffering is about perception, meaning can transform suffering into pain that's manageable, and so we can reframe to find that meaning. And if we can discover meaning in the midst of suffering, it's one of the key characteristics of moral resilience, which Professor Cinda Rushton talks a lot about. She's an ethicist, and she talks a lot about moral resilience. So, reframing and thinking about things differently. And what that cartoon says is that it says if you can't change it, change the way you think about it. So where do we get this meaning? How do we get meaning? You can explore different ways to find meaning in what's happening. I can't tell everybody in here exactly how to do this, right? What brings ultimate meaning to people or what's meaningful will be different for different people. Some people may turn to religious beliefs or philosophical values for imparting meaning to events. I think these are the stories that we tell ourselves, right, Dr. Thompson? That how you impart meaning to what's happening is a story that you tell yourself. Why am I here? Why is this happening? And what is the reason of it? And so sometimes you have to look for that, though. And so I want to talk a little bit in this last section here about religious beliefs and how religious beliefs can give meaning to suffering. And I want to talk about in the context of my tradition, the Islamic faith. So as an Abrahamic faith, Islam shares aspects of belief and practice with other faiths that have a person's relationship with God as a primary focus. Islam emphasizes worshiping God with love, devotion, gratitude, and living according to his guidance, and God is seen as the cherisher and sustainer of all creation. Muslims believe that the events that happen in a person's life are part of God's plan to nurture and develop them so that each challenge comes with an opportunity for benefit and spiritual growth. So illness and pain are seen as part of the human condition by God's design. Everybody's going to experience pain in some way or other. We've kind of established that. But Islam doesn't view illness itself as either good or bad. Illness is seen, or the hardships are seen as a state prescribed by God that has the potential to bring a person closer to them. And Islam teaches that going through hardship can be good in the following ways. For instance, the experience may help people appreciate their dependence on God. It might increase your sincerity in worship, bringing people closer to God. The times that you're really on your knees praying from the depths of your soul is usually when something bad has happened that you're perceiving and you're asking for help. Usually when we're fine and everything's going well, sometimes we forget, to kind of be in that state of devotion. It can expiate sins, it can teach patience, and it can increase gratitude for times of ease. People are, in the Islamic faith, people are not supposed to seek out or tolerate suffering just for the sake of experiencing the suffering, but like we talked about the palliative medicine space, after everything has been done that can relieve it, whatever's left, it can help you to cope and give a story or meaning. So I wanted to just share with you 4 teachings that are reflections from the Islamic tradition. Okay, one is there, and I'm not saying that the other traditions don't have these same approaches, but from my own tradition, they're important. But there can be healing without cure. You can have cancer. You can be dying. Changing your story, changing your meaning, like reframing how you're looking at it can help people to feel healed, even though that cancer is still there, and even though they're still going to die from it. You see that? Muslims believe that everything that God does is good. Like, though Muslims don't think that the world is broken. They think that the world is exactly as God created it, not because God is negative, but because his purpose is beyond ours, and ultimately only he knows his wisdoms, but they're there, they're beneficent, and they're all loving, and they're all merciful. And it's our vision that's challenged in terms of understanding what's going on. So we need to trust in that process and in God as we look at the world. Whatever happens or God allows to happen on some level is good, although certainly God allows things to happen that people do that he wouldn't have chosen for them. I mean, we certainly see that. But we can trust the universe is not out of control, although we don't understand always God's wisdom. We approach life with patience, with gratitude, and the meaning from an Islamic perspective would be that if God has put you in the situation for your benefit, it's for a benevolent reason. And I guess the ring that people have a lot, like if God brings you to it, he will bring you through it, is certainly a part of what Muslims would believe. And here's another interesting thing. In terms of testing, Muslims do believe that part of what happens on this earth is a test for us in terms of our hopefully being able to remain faithful and remain patient. A Quranic verse says, I, God, will surely test you with something of fear and hunger and loss of wealth and lives and the fruits of your toil, but give glad tidings to the patient, who, when disaster strikes them, say, indeed we belong to God, and to him we will return. They are the ones who receive God's blessings and mercy, and it is they who are rightly guided, and they who have the Lord's grace and mercy, and they are guided. So another interesting thing is that, yes, we talked about the pain is there to elevate you, to purify you, to bring you closer to God, to expiate your sins. And in fact, there's also this belief that the people that God loves the most, he gives the most hardship to. Now, that might be like, okay, thanks a lot. But if you think about it, the people that he wants the best for, the good people, the ones with a special connection with God, these are the ones that God can give the gift of hardship, the gift of pain, to help elevate them and bless them further and draw them closer to himself and to offer the benefits that we talked about. So it's a little bit different perspective on, hardship. Of course, not everyone's going to benefit from this experience of pain or suffering. Some people will become bitter and will turn away from God. So benefiting from the hardship is not a given, but instead an opportunity. And the teaching from the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, is this verse, wondrous is the affair of the believer, for there is good for him in every matter, and this is not the case with anyone except the believer. If he's happy, then he thanks God, and thus there's good for him. If he's harmed, then he shows patience, and there is good for him. So Muslims try to look at everything that happened as good, like literally good, and then kind of live their life like that. And then the last thing is this idea that the illness or hardship is the cure. We get sick, we get hardship, we pray for cure, right? We pray for cure. But there's also this idea that what God gives you is the cure for what you need. He gives us what we need, not what we want. And I wanted to share a story that kind of illustrates this. A very close friend of mine from childhood was diagnosed with breast cancer about 5 years ago. And she went through surgery, radiation, went into remission, and then last year her cancer came back and she started the surgeries and chemotherapy again. After she went through that whole process again, she said, as I look back, as difficult as the cancer situation all was, it sounds crazy to someone who doesn't have faith or belief, but I'm grateful. I'm grateful because it brought me closer to God. It was an extremely humbling experience, and it really made me realize how absolutely dependent I am on God, how absolutely dependent we all are as his creation. You know that they say when you go through a test or difficulty, I guess at the end of the day, if it brings you closer to God, then there's only good in it. So that's the lesson I took. May God protect us from being turned away from our religion or from having our faith tested or from us questioning God and his ultimate wisdom. But may any test or difficulty or trial that we go through only bring us closer to him because it's all good. As Sheikh Hamza Yusuf said, it's all good for the believer. So I don't know if this next round of chemo will bring physical cure from her cancer, but I can see that the experience has brought her great healing regardless of what happens next. So the way that the Arabic language looks at this word of trials or tests is the Arabic word has at its letters root, F, T, and N, like fatah, nun. And this word has many meanings. So fitna and fatan are from the same root, and they're tied together. A fitna is a trial, temptation, affliction, or distress, but a fatan is a goldsmith. So you might think, how are those two related? And the idea is that a goldsmith takes raw ore, raw rock with gold and sand and impurities and puts it into a fire or furnace. Gold melts at almost 2,000 degrees. But because of this heat and because of this stress, the impurities are removed and the gold is cleansed of the baser elements and comes out beautiful and pure. So Muslims look at the process of hardship as one that purifies a person, similar to how gold is purified through heat. And Muslims believe that God gives people hardship so he may purify them, and that going through that process of hardship and struggle, they become cleansed of impurities and emerge with a character that is beautified by the transformation. So as we look at the topic of pain and suffering and finding hope in suffering, I wanted to just end with saying that religious beliefs can help decouple that idea that you're going to have pain, you're going to have discomfort, but can decouple it from the experience of suffering, where it's an interpretation of the pain in a really, like, in a bad way that makes you suffer. The appearance of pain we're all going to have, but hopefully with this practice with like decoupling, we may not have that experience of suffering in the same way that we might had we not had that kind of approach. And we have hope that what happens to us is an opportunity to get closer to God, and what God has prescribed for us to purify us and bring us closer to Him and to beautify our character is part of His beneficence and taking care of us. And I'll leave you with two quotes from Rumi: "The wound is the place where the light enters you." And from Dr. Viktor Frankl: "What is to give light must endure burning."
Yeah, we are now going to transition into a time of Q&A that'll be facilitated by Dr. Brill. And if you have any questions, you can, just text into the number on the screen and we will begin briefly.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Mobin-Uddin and Dr. Thompson. This was really wonderful, and just as the moderator, I was taking some notes and learned so much from both of you. One of the things that I really loved was the way you framed suffering. One of the key things that I took away from your presentation, Dr. Mobin-Uddin, is this idea that finding meaning through faith can create resilience in suffering. And from you, Dr. Thompson, the idea that the experience of being loved can sustain us through suffering. So those were a couple key things that I took away from this. So while the audience is thinking about their questions and texting those, I wanted to just start with a few questions. So first of all, I wanted to give each of you an opportunity to reflect on your co-presenters' comments. So if I could start with you, Dr. Mobin-Uddin, if you could just take 2 minutes to respond to what Dr. Thompson said and what your reflections are there.
Thank you, Dr. Brill. Yeah. I feel like there are many commonalities. Like, seems like we're saying something very similar in terms of the stories that you tell yourself about who you are, how you fit in the universe, who God is, helps you interpret your life. And when you find meaning in that, you find a greater purpose and maybe have God that you could like rely on, say, okay, I may not know what's going on, but somebody does. It heals and it helps. And I think that was the theme of both of our approaches. So I found that powerful. And from a psychiatrist as well, you know, this idea that maybe helping people explore the stories that they're telling and develop the stories that they're telling can also be a way of healing that's even on a different level than just maybe how usually people might approach things, because you can give yourself permission to include religion as part of how you're interpreting your life. So I think that was one thing that was really powerful for me.
What you thought from Dr. Mobin-Uddin's presentation?
Well, I could go on and on and on about the things that I found to be helpful and moving. I think one of the first things that really jumped off the page at me was I loved how you set us all up to think that we were really going to be talking about someone in a hospital bed when it was really like a runner. Do you do that with all of your students, people? Is this what you do? So I found like it was a powerful example of how even we in the audience are telling a certain story in our minds about who this person is that we think, and it's an example of how I tell a certain story about me in a certain way. You walk into the room and you invite me to consider telling a different story. And it's a story that I can't imagine until you begin to help me imagine that differently, which is really what you were doing with us here in the audience. And so I found that to be just a powerful example of the very thing that you were talking about, not just the content of what you were describing through that story, but the very way that you were doing that. That was one thing. I also really appreciated your identifying and reminding us that there are multiple different ways for us to shift our attention, whether that's through mindfulness practices, whether that's through turning our attention toward productive work, a range of different things that we can do to shift our attention in such a way that our pain can be transformed in that way. And so I ultimately appreciate it. And then your emphasis, I think, on how the way that we tell the story, the way that we respond to our pain and our suffering goes a long way in shaping the question of, like, well, who am I becoming in the world? How is this, my response to this pain, shaping who I am? Which, of course, leads to often, it's difficult for me to be asking the question, who do I want to become a day from now, a week from now, when I'm in the middle of this space? And I just found that to be a really captivating and intriguing question that I think is really helpful for all of us to be considering. Because I think it's easy for me to be thinking, like, well, what is happening to me? How is this about me? Not who am I becoming, and on whose behalf can I become this for others?
Great. Those were great reflections. One thing that I wanted to talk about was, both of you were talking a little bit about the commonalities, and I saw so many commonalities between your presentations, including one that surprised me, which was thinking about suffering as something we experience in the course of being edified, whether it's studying or training for a marathon. But I also wanted to ask you, what distinctions or what differences did you hear in each other's presentations across your two worldviews?
You want me to go first?
Sure.
I think there's a couple things that I'm aware of. I mean, I would probably say, and again, this would be from my Muslim sisters and brothers whom I've known in the past and currently, and from what I'm aware of, is that this notion of the world being broken or not being broken is something we who would look at the biblical narrative, we would say the biblical narrative is a story of a world that's broken, and that it's not a neutral playing field where we are, and that in fact we are responsible for so much of the brokenness, perhaps not all of it, but that we play a role in our suffering, that suffering is not just a thing that happens to me of which only God, and maybe I was misunderstanding that, of only which God is like in charge of, but there are things that we are doing to each other, we are doing to ourselves that create that, that we would say don't necessarily lead to my edification. If I'm an alcoholic and I'm drinking more and more and more, that's creating my own set of suffering by the actions that I take. And so I would say that's one element where I would say we probably, if I understood that correctly, I would say, yeah, we think, but I think the other thing that we would say about the stories that we believe are true about the world we live in is that, we talk about in the biblical narrative, we talk about this notion of a triune God. We talk about this notion of God the Father, God the Son, and God the Spirit. And what's significant about suffering from a Christian perspective is that God is not just standing apart from us, testing us with it. Certainly testing is part of the commonality, I think, that happens for us and how that shapes who we are. But we would say that God actually suffers with us, that God comes to be with us in the person of Jesus, and that there's nothing that we are going through that in terms of suffering's terms, God himself has not also suffered with us and on our behalf. So I don't know if that's an accurate representation of how we diverge or not, but that's something that I would say.
Great. Thank you for those reflections. And Dr. Mobin-Uddin, could you talk from your perspective as far as from the Islamic worldview, how distinctions and differences that you saw between your worldview and the one presented by Dr. Thompson?
Yeah, thank you. And I was thinking the same thing about this question of what is the nature of the world, because I went to Catholic school, and I have many Christian friends, and also just this understanding, like, what does it mean for the world to be broken? What does it mean? What, fallen situation? Like, what does that mean, and how do you interpret that for yourself? So I think that is a key difference in perspective on the world. So I would also agree with that. Maybe this might be interesting to share. The story of Adam and Eve is told in the Quran as well. The account is a little different. They were in the Garden of Eden. They were told by God not to approach a particular tree. they ate of the fruit of the tree. Eve is not blamed for eating of the fruit of the tree. They're both blamed, and in one of the verses, Adam is blamed. So it's not something that was related just to Eve. And they felt their nakedness and started sewing leaves and covering themselves. So there's some interesting similarities. And then they were to go down to earth, partially as a consequence, but also part of God's initial plan. So Muslims don't believe that it was just the fall that put them on earth, but that God was, in his ultimate wisdom, going to put people on earth. But one key difference is that in the Quranic account, Adam and Eve are remorseful, and they beg for God's forgiveness, and he forgives them. And he says, for people who follow my way, which I will send to you, I'll teach you the way, on them shall be no fear, nor shall they grieve. So that's a key difference. And I think it really reflects also then how people understand humanity and other things, because Muslims believe that Adam, yes, and Eve, they sinned, but they begged God for forgiveness, and he forgave them, and he gave them hope that, if you follow my way, you're not going to, you will be okay. So that, I think, is something that is a difference. But I think it's interesting, between my time in Christian Catholic school and other things. So what do we do with this? Like, there's all this stuff. Who gives you hope? I think in both faith traditions, God gives you hope. He gives you forgiveness, and he gives you the path to redemption. Through Christianity, maybe through the figure of Jesus, right, you're talking about. And through Islam, it's a little bit more of a direct line, because we don't believe that people carry original sin, but that the sins that you carry are the ones that you yourself have done, but not original sin. And so to ask God for forgiveness directly and to be repentant and to try to live in the right way, God, through his mercy and compassion, could forgive you. And so both faith traditions offer forgiveness and redemption as a gift from God that people don't deserve, that people didn't earn, but solely through his mercy and his compassion. And I think that's a parallel that is overreaching, even though the specifics of the mechanics of it are very different.
Thank you so much for sharing those perspectives. I have one final question before we transition to the audience Q&A. This is more practical. So if somebody, and I'm sure there are many individuals in the audience who are experiencing suffering, what would you just say to someone who is looking for greater experience of hope, potentially through experience of encountering God or otherwise? What would you say to them on practically how they could proceed? What is the next step they could take? And maybe go first, Dr. Mobin-Uddin.
Sure, absolutely. So I think starting off with that sincerity, the sincerity that you're seeking, the humility of being open to how God may guide you, asking for direction. In Islamic tradition, it says that in the Quran, if you ask for guidance, God will guide you. So being open, being humble, being sincere, and asking God to direct you, and then kind of listening with your life, with your world, and trying to do the right thing, I think is helpful. Seeking out, you talked about seeking out fellowship, certainly very important, seeking knowledge, seeking comfort, asking people who know in ways that they can help you for whatever you're struggling with. I think those are all ways, but I think the humility and the sincerity of the approach and that attempt to remain patient and remain open and vulnerable to how God may work in your life can be an amazing starting point.
Thank you so much. Dr. Thompson?
It's rare that I end up talking about much without talking about the role of what we like to talk about as attachment research. And the notion that a baby comes into the world, and the first experience of suffering that a human has is like coming into the world. Right? They get into the world and they're like, why am I here? I was really digging the last 9 months a lot better than where I am at the moment. And this whole sense of suffering from a newborn and infant and toddler's perspective, for instance, is, and like what they do with their own distress that has anybody here babysat kids? You're barely able to admit it though, aren't you? It's just difficult. This sense that when children are in distress, what calms their distress is the presence of another human being who comes to their aid. And the thing is that, like, that doesn't stop until we're dead, no matter what the age is. And so from a practical standpoint, for those of us in the audience who have some part of us, and if we're not suffering now, we will be. And the question that I would invite you to consider is, who are the people that I'm willing to approach? And whether you're a person of faith or not, who are the people that are, who's the person, the one, the two, the three people that I'm willing to approach and say, this is my story. Are you willing to listen to this? Are you willing to receive it? Are you willing to be empathic for me? Are you willing to be present with me and for me in the middle of my pain? And in so doing, this, as we've been saying, this does not eliminate the pain. I love this notion of you're saying that, like, there's a difference between healing and cure. I've lost 3 brothers to cancer. And when my first brother died 20 years ago, I mean, he, after a three-year battle with pancreatic cancer, and he said, I wouldn't wish cancer on my worst enemy, but I can tell you, I'm not sorry that this has happened. As we watch the transformation of his life from a person who became a person of greater love, joy, peace, patience, and kindness through his journey in the middle of all this. And so much of that had to do with his faith experience, but also with his experience with other people who were coming to know his story deeply, and him coming to know his story deeply because other people were willing to be present with him and hear that. And my wondering is, who are the people who are in the room, who are the people in your lives who know your story well enough so that when your suffering comes, they are the people to whom you will go that will help mitigate that?
Of course.
Yeah, so, and one thing I wanted to kind of build on that from a pediatrician standpoint, the babies who get responded to, right? Like that people go in and comfort them when they're crying because that's their way of communicating. They get settled down. They know that when I cry out, somebody comes, right? It's a way of their building the secure trust in the world. They cry less later. They're more secure. They're more attached. So I know it may have been fashionable, or earlier grandmas or whoever may tell you, let them cry it out. I don't think that's good advice, because it just teaches a child that I can scream out and there's nobody out there. And those kids are more anxious, less secure, and they cry more as toddlers than the babies that you go in and you touch and you comfort when they cry out. So building that security and the way of them even understanding that you can trust the world is really important. So, yeah. We have to put the
Yes.
the medical stuff too, right? So.
Absolutely. As, Dr. Mobin-Uddin and I are both pediatricians, so we're really loving this attachment, child development discussion here. Wonderful. Well, I wanted to go ahead and transition to audience Q&A, because I'm sure we're going to have some wonderful questions here. So our first question is related to the connection between your profession as medical physicians and how you've attended to the spiritual health of your patients. How have you both, in a medical setting, cared for your patients' spiritual health as a route to decouple pain from suffering? And Dr. Mobin-Uddin, I'll have you go first.
Sure. Yeah, and this is my role as a clinical ethicist, because I deal more with adult patients. Thankfully, I haven't had the end-of-life issues with my pediatric practice. But it's really interesting and hard, because for people who have whose faith is really important to them, you know how important faith will be at end of life, right? But the culture around medicine is there's a lot of hesitation in what's okay, what's not okay. Will something be seen as proselytizing? Does the patient want to talk about this? So people feel inhibited in terms of bringing up some of these spiritual questions. So there are, training things where people talk to you about how to take a spiritual history or how to, engage. But a lot of times people are not very comfortable doing that. But I think that the questions are so profound. So I do ethics. Here's an ethics question that we might get asked. One is it ethically appropriate to sedate a patient until they die? Like a person who has a terminal illness, they're in the hospital, they're suffering with something, pain or whatever, and they want to be snowed and just sedated until they end up passing away. Is that ethical or not, especially if they want it? Okay, we certainly do treat pain with sedation, right? And if your pain is breaking through, we're going to help treat it so that you're not suffering from the pain. So people may have pain from their cancer, and they may have bone pain. But some people have existential pain, right? They have regrets. They can't fix what happened. They have relationships that are not healed. And they have a lot of regrets about their life, and now they're dying. And they want the sedation to help treat their existential pain. Is that right or wrong? So, and could support from like chaplaincy or other people who could give that support really help make the difference for this patient in choosing to just go dark or to try to work through some of their issues. So I think absolutely support is important. We try to do what we can. We try to be open. I find it much easier when people have the same faith tradition, because then you feel like they have an understanding. And if they're asking you questions, they really want the answers. And so we have discussions. Otherwise, I just try to be like open and supportive and ask kind of more general questions and let it be a patient-led type of interaction so that I'm not inappropriately like somehow pushing something on them or something, but being open to what they might really want to talk about.
Thank you. Dr. Thompson.
Just real quick, I mean, I think the nature of the question raised, I mean, I think also kind of pulls the curtain back on our anthropology about what we think is true about who we are as human beings. So for instance, when we talk about our spiritual health, we talk about that as if it is some separate compartment of what it means to be human. And that is, you know, that's a result of modernity. That's not a self-evident thing that is out there. As a follower of Jesus, we would say everything is spiritual, right? There's nothing that is not spiritual. In addition to that, part of the question is, you know, we have plenty of people who come to our clinic who would call themselves Christians, and yet if you were to ask them what the nature of God is that is in their head, he doesn't sound very biblical, as it turns out. He's a God who's pretty contemptuous. He's a God who's pretty angry. He's a God who's all the things that you would say that God is not, right? That God's not very merciful. And so in some respects, you can't really separate what my spiritual life is from what my developmental life is, from what my attachment processes are. And so a lot of this is presumed that anytime we're talking about anything, we're actually getting at questions of spirituality. We're getting at questions of what does it mean for me to believe whatever the story is that I think that I'm living in. And so, I mean, in some respects, it's a matter of also helping to invite people to consider, well, if you want to talk about your spiritual life, what is that, even when you mean that? So that we're not making, the first thing I don't want to do is to assume that I know what that means for them and be more curious about that. And in so doing, I know that when you're in a university setting, when you're in a hospital setting, things may be more challenging in terms of, you know, where your ethics, not that you're ethical and I'm not, I think, but you know what I mean. This sense of there may be more things that you have to pay attention to. But I think, again, this question for me raises questions about how we tell the story about what spirituality actually even is, that is part of our interaction with folks. Because I think that we would say that when we're doing healing work, you're doing spiritual work right along with it.
Thank you so much for that thoughtful answer. And so I think we're ready for our next question. So the question is about differences. If the mechanisms for redemption between Islam and Christianity are so different, how would you, maybe I'll reframe this question a little bit. So how would you describe the mechanism of redemption for Islam, Dr. Mobin-Uddin, to a Christian, and how would you say that differs from your Christian friends' view of redemption?
Yeah, I mean, I've been impressed that, as I said, the overarching approach for both faith traditions is that God offers you the gift of redemption and forgiveness. God offers it, right? He gives it freely. It's not like something people deserve. And so I think that's something we can both kind of maybe have as an overarching value. But I do think the mechanisms are different, as you mentioned. So within Islam, it's much more of a personal relationship with God. There's not a verse that says you can't get to heaven if you're not perfect. So Muslims don't aspire to be perfect. They aspire to do their best effort to try and to count on God's mercy and forgiveness. Repentance is important if you sin. You know, it certainly, God accepts repentance, God accepts prayers, and God is able to forgive directly. So if you are sincere about your repentance and you're making an intention not to redo something, and you ask sincerely for forgiveness, the belief is that God will forgive you. It doesn't mean that you're not going to sin again. You may absolutely go back to that same sin and go through the same cycle of repentance. But those are the things that are important, the intention and the effort. And then that's all, with God's acceptance and mercy, that could be what gets you to heaven. So there's not a concept that you have to be perfect to get to heaven. I think that's it. I mean, you can talk about what it means for Christianity, but I think that's something I would say that I felt as a difference, like when I was in Catholic school and things like that, that some of the verses that, or some of the ways people interpret the scripture put a barrier that then has, Jesus overcoming it, right? But I don't feel like Muslims had the same maybe perspective on some of the barriers. Like I talked about the original sin and Adam and Eve and things like that. So I think that's probably, just it.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And Dr. Thompson, if you could speak to the mechanism of redemption in the Christian worldview and where you may differ in that mechanism from your Muslim friends.
Right. So I think it's fair to say that I think we can say that both stories can't be true. We would say, like, we're talking about two different ways of understanding the world. And the reality is that nobody's really going to know what the true story actually is until we get to the end. We can't know that with certainty. We know this with trust. You trust, I trust, we're trusting in a particular story. And I also think that it's important to know that there can be lots of differences. And we would say but what I can say about what redemption means for me is that I do think I'm broken, but I also think that that is, and the shame and the fear and the so forth that is associated with that, when the presence of Jesus that I read about in the scriptures and that I see in the sense of the body of faith, when people are with me in my pain and in my brokenness and in my shame, and I have a felt sense of being seen, soothed, safe, secure in the face of my the parts of me that I hate the most, this becomes a viscerally felt sense of what it means to be loved by God. It's not, and this is what the scriptures would talk about, and that in that space, it's not hard for me to believe that I'm forgiven. I'm not forgiven just because someone gives me some posited truth that I'm forgiven. I'm forgiven because I feel it in my chest. I sense it in my abdomen. I sense it in my body. And so that sense of redemption is coming because I'm ultimately not by myself, and I have, like, I look at my life and you say, like, oh goodness, it's not just that Jesus has come to redeem, like to save me from sin and take me to heaven. Like, that's not the biblical narrative. The biblical narrative is that we were made to rule on the earth. We human beings were made to be kings and queens on the earth. This is Genesis chapter 1 and 2. And that has not changed in terms of God's mission, in terms of like where he still is taking us. This sense of redemption is not just to save us from sin, it is to turn us into the kind of people who can live in what the New Testament would call the new heaven and earth that is already broken in and is also coming in its fullness. And so part of what hope is for me is not just about what I do with suffering, it's about how suffering is helping turn me into the kind of person I want to be for the world that's coming. As Dallas Willard once said, God will let anyone into his heaven who can take it, who can tolerate it. And can we tolerate that heaven when it gets here? I think the other thing is that both of our worldviews, both of our plausibility structures of seeing how the world actually is, creates opportunity for hope to be formed. I think there's no question about that. And in fact, you can be a person who doesn't believe in Jesus, doesn't believe in Allah, doesn't hold either of these faith traditions, and you're still living a life of hope. The fact that you're going to the university means you're hopeful that you're going to get a degree there. Hope is being formed all the time. And I think that there are lots of ways in which people can form hope that don't necessarily include being part of a faith tradition. In the same way that you can have good physical shape, you're going to work out and you're going to be that, and you might not have anything to do with Jesus whatsoever. But that's a different question than what does it mean for us to believe in the kingdom of God? What does it mean for us to believe that we live in a world in which I'm not just trying to deal with my suffering appropriately, but I'm also trying to answer the question, what kind of a person am I becoming? Because I'm living in a story that's trying to get me ready for the world that's coming as well.
Thank you so much. So I think we're ready for the next question. Is there anything about your personal experience in the world that has changed or evolved your outlook on hope, especially as it fits with religion and God? So Dr. Thompson, maybe I could start with you on this one.
Yeah, maybe I'm just getting older. Maybe that's what's changed things for me. As I've said recently to a number of my friends, you look around at the world and things are like, you're just like, oh gosh, it's not a picnic, right? Things are not in the best shape that we've been in. We can look around and say things are really difficult. And I can say I have never been more hopeful about the presence of Jesus in the world. I've never been more hopeful about the gospel. I've never been more hopeful for the world. And you can list all the top 10 things about why we shouldn't be. And I can tell you that because of the gospel, I've never been more hopeful about what I see that's happening in the world, primarily because it's one thing for me to look at the world at large. I can look at climate change and I think like, wow, we are so cooked. Like, this is not going to end well. And you can think like, that's not a very hopeful posture to have. You can look at all kinds of things that we need to be working on and working about. And at the same time, I have relationships with my patients, I have relationships with my family, I have relationships with people that I have great difference with, in which I'm watching redemption happen every single day. And by redemption, I don't mean they become Christians. I mean, these are people who are working to become people of greater love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. They become people who want to be living, breathing outposts of the Sermon on the Mount, sometimes even if they don't know that they're following Jesus yet. But I'm watching these kinds of transformations happen, and to me, that's what gives me real hope in real time and space.
Thank you for sharing that. Dr. Mobin-Uddin?
Yeah, I think looking back, the times that have been the hardest, then that we've struggled in those deepest times where we really do feel very broken and very alone. And I think for me, it's been a couple of experiences with life-threatening illnesses in family members. My father's cancer. My daughter had a life-threatening illness as well. I think at those times, when you're in the middle of it, it's really, really hard, right? But one of the chronic teachings is that with hardship is ease, that God gives you blessings within those hardships. But I feel like when you're kind of through it and you're looking back, you realize what you learn, like how you're transformed. Like with my father's eventual, cancer, the diagnosis, the journey, and when he ended up dying, I really turned to God a lot. I think it makes you so much more humble. It makes you so much more dependent. It just allows you sometimes to just give it to God and just be like, I can't do it myself, so you take it and just help me understand and give me the strength. And that was transformational in terms of healing for me. So after my father died, and he was really like the kindest person I ever knew and all this kind of stuff. I mean, he was really close to me. I realized that I didn't want to go back to before he had his cancer because I had changed so much in my relationship to God. I was just in a better place, like a more solid place, a more humble place. I felt like I had grown. And that sounds really weird to say, like, you don't want to go back to before your dad died. And especially like we had a beautiful, kind relationship. But I valued the character, religious, development so much that it was, I don't want to say worth it, but I could see how I changed because of it. I would never have picked it, but that's what it was. And I could tell that it was valuable to me because I was like, I wouldn't want to go back, even though with all the struggle. And even to have him here, I believe and hope that I will see him in the next life in a good way, right? But I think that's powerful because it's so easy to think I would just like to remind my life and have my dad back and all this kind of stuff. And in a sense, yes, but then I think of how I was before that and I think, gosh, would I want to give up those spiritual gifts that I gained? And it came a time when the answer was like, gosh, I really don't want to give that up. And that's a way of trusting God and a way of knowing that what he does is best and is good.
Great. So our last question of the night, this is a good one. Do both of these religious traditions believe that God intends pain? And if so, can I question God's choice to give me suffering? So Dr. Mobin-Uddin, maybe you could take a first attempt at this one.
Did I? Oh, yeah, here we go. Okay, yeah. No, thank you. Thank you for your thoughtful questions. So do we believe that God intends pain? And can I question God's choice to give me suffering? I think as a human being, you have to be honest with your own feelings and your thoughts. So to say, can I or should I don't know that that's helpful. I think feelings are feelings. You experience what you're experiencing. So I wouldn't recommend trying to just tamp it down or deny it. If you might feel angry, you might feel, why me? You might feel, is this really okay? I think it's okay to have the feelings and then try to work through them. Does God intend pain? I think in the Islamic tradition, as I read that verse, God says in the Quran, I'm going to test you with some loss of lives and fruits of your toil and, things like that. So there's going to be testing. We're human beings. We feel it as pain. It's not like God is trying to be mean to you. This is part of his greater purpose. And, as we understand that maybe when we go through difficulties, we grow and we become better people, we understand that that struggle is part of what it means to be human and part of what can elevate us to a better state. And so we accept it as part of the process. I don't think God is mean. I don't think God likes, when people are suffering. I think in his wisdom, he knows it's for a better thing. From a pediatrician standpoint, since we get to talk about pediatrics, I think about my kids who come in for vaccines, right? Now I guess I was practicing pediatrics before ethics. I think this question about vaccines was a whole different thing then, but just assume that vaccines are good and, kids are coming for the vaccines. I remember maybe a 3-year-old who came in and he was getting vaccines that day in the pediatric office. And in those days, we often had the moms help hold a little bit more. I mean, now, hold them, give them a hug or something just so that they're not totally, isolated. And he was so indignant and angry that his mother would hold him down and let this happen. And he's like, how can you do that? You hurt my feelings, to his mom after he got the vaccines. So what is his mom doing? Is she happy? No, half the time the moms cry too because it's hard for them. But they know that it's a process that will keep their child safer, healthier, and potentially protected from more devastation. So that's where it is. So do we understand the wisdom of God? Does the 3-year-old understand? Can they understand? They really can't. So after a certain point, it becomes an issue of trust. And so, yes, you can question, you can struggle with it, you can have your emotions. I think on a journey and a path to developing trust in God, maybe some people would get to the point where they'll say, okay, I believe it. Other people may still struggle and say, I don't think it's fair, I still don't think it's right, even after all this whole discussion.
Thank you for your response. Dr. Thompson?
I think there are probably a lot of situations that we could describe in which we would say that pain is not something that the person intends, but rather it is a natural consequence of what's happening. The surgeon doesn't intend pain in order to remove the cancer or the inflamed gallbladder, but pain is necessarily going to happen. We don't like the idea that we have pain sensors on the end of our fingers, as you mentioned, when we touch the hot burner, until we recognize that it's touching the hot burner, and then we're actually glad that we do so that we don't burn our hand. So there's a sense in which pain is a normal, it's a normal part of life. But it is striking that we ask the question, does God intend it? And the whole question of intention is also one of the most important questions that we human beings ask. What's your intention for me? What's any of our intentions for someone else? We all have had experiences of pain and even suffering in which the reason why it's happened is because there's been an accident that's been caused that is not a person's intention to hurt us. But when a person does intend to hurt us, that gives us a whole different level of experience. And we would say in the biblical tradition that God's not intending pain, but God is wanting to be present with you in whatever pain happens. And God is allowing for testing to take place in these places turning us into the kind of people that he wants us to become. And when we say, do we question God's choice? There's this sense in which if you read the Psalms, the Psalter, of 150 Psalms, fully a third of them are Psalms of lament. These are Psalms of complaint about their pain and their suffering. And so we would say that the Hebrews wrote these Psalms because they believed in a God who could take it and who was asking for it, who is asking for complaint, who wants to wrestle with people in the middle of the real world that we really occupy. And so I think it's less a matter of, taking seriously that we serve a God, we would say that we serve a God who is not intending for pain, intending for suffering, but is present with us and wants to turn us into newer and different kind of people on the backside of all that.